Chapter 17. Yes, I must admit again that from the moment I set eyes on him, surrounded by his eager listeners under the withered fig tree, I could not rid myself of him. There was in his manner of utterance a curious power to invest with reality whatever he said. His very appearance, his posture, his relationship to people awakened a profound faith and boundless trust. I must go further in my confession. For all my jesting remarks to the centurion, little was wanting to draw me into the magic circle. If I did not succumb, if I did not fall a victim to that Asiatic magnetic force as other Romans did, I have to thank my manly character and the severe discipline of my upbringing. And yet, I repeat, there was a time during which I could not quite free myself from the man. Nor is it really to be wondered at. I have witnessed more than once the extremes to which the power of faith can go. We Romans, outsiders as we are, cannot conceive to what extent the Jews are the dupes of faith. One had to see them on the high holy days in their temple courts. They stood jammed against each other so that not a finger could have been inserted between body and body. Nevertheless, they persuaded themselves that when they threw themselves to the ground to confess their sins, a miracle occurred, and there was so much room around each man that his neighbor could not hear his confession. And for them, it was actually so. What happened, I cannot tell, whether the place was actually extended or whether they shrank so upon themselves that one body did not touch the next. Again, they believed that in all the temple, in which innumerable animals were being slaughtered continuously for the sacrifices, not a single fly ever appeared. I grant that faith exists for the purpose of making the incredible appear credible. Our gods, too, are not without power in this respect. Zeus can transform himself into a swan or a golden cloud. By the power which those Jews ascribed to their God, the faith which they reposed in him had no parallel elsewhere. It was an art in which they had no equal. I now learned that the man was widely known and loved in Capharnaum. He was a prominent rabbi, accepted not only by the fisher folk of the little port, but also by the scholars of the vicinity. Particularly had his reputation risen when he had declared solemnly in their synagogue that he had come not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. He was even reported to have used these words, "Sooner shall the heavens and the earth pass away than one jot or tittle of the law," or words like them. This, by the way, was typical of the arrogance with which the Jews spoke of their sacred books. In this tremendous self-conceit, the rabbi, whatever his other differences with the official rabbis, was wholly like them. All of them were convinced that divine power resided solely in their sacred books, which had been handed down from the heavens. In any case, if there had been friction between the man and the scholars of Capharnaum and vicinity, it disappeared after he had made this extravagantly patriotic declaration in their synagogue. His performance of miracles did not affect them adversely. On the contrary, it was perfectly proper that the learned should assist the sick by prayers and miracles, and he was by no means the only rabbi familiar with these practices. He had his own pupils and disciples. True, they were not of the learned class. They came from among the poor, a few fisher folk who had left their trade and their livelihood to follow him. He lived with one of them, the very man, in fact, who had rescued him that day from the overseers. This was his first disciple. I made the acquaintance of this fisherman. Simon was the name he went by at that time. A simple man, below medium height, but of tremendous strength, with a bearded face which storm and wind had hardened into stone. His mighty, squat body was filled with head to foot with a strange and tender love for his rabbi. It sometimes happened that when the crowds of the poor and the sick pressed too close upon the rabbi, threatening to crush him in their ranks, the fisherman would lift him up in his arms and bear him away, as a father bears away a child. Simon lived only for his Lord, and it was touching to see this hardy Cyclops standing among the fishers in the port or the worshippers in the synagogue and gazing with open-mouthed and tremulous happiness at the preacher. Tears of enthusiasm gathered in his eyes. Among the other disciples there was a brother of this Simon, likewise a fisherman who had left his nets to follow his master. So it often was among the Jews. They held their rabbis dearer than their own families. They could sometimes leave house and field, wife and a child, trade and livelihood, in order to attach themselves to a teacher. There were 2 other brothers who followed the man. Their names were Jacob and Yochanan. Their mother was a rich woman of Bet Zayada, a little town not far from Capharnaum. They had gone away from her to be with the teacher. A fierce couple they were, these 2 disciples, true Maccabeans, stormy spirits. They were ready with fist and knife for anyone who dared to speak evil of their rabbi. They were forever at loggerheads with the other Jews, and their rabbi had to hold them in check for fear of disturbances. But his most beloved and most devoted disciple was Simon, with whom he stayed, not actually in Simon's house, but in the house of Simon's mother-in-law. On the occasion of another visit to Capharnaum, not long after, I followed the rabbi with others to his home. Whenever he appeared in the harbor or near the synagogue, he was surrounded by crowds of the sick and the poor who implored his help. They went along with him through the streets, and this time I followed the rabble at a distance till we came to the court where stood the house of Simon's mother-in-law. At the gate of the court, Simon turned and with his burly figure blocked the way. "Let him rest a while," he begged of the importunate mob. "Do you not see that he is weak?" Then, looking up, he perceived me. By now I was not unknown to him. He had seen me more than once in the company of my friend the centurion, in the streets of Capharnaum, or standing on the outskirts of a crowd which his teacher was addressing. Out of respect for a Roman officer, he let me pass. It was a poor courtyard, enclosed by a hedge of twigs intertwined with palm leaves. In the center stood a few lean, dusty fig trees and palms, such as you would find in every poor Jewish yard. They could not do without palms, for they put these trees to a great variety of uses, including shelter. In the summer, the leaves afforded shade. In the winter, they were a protection against the rain. The bark of the trees had been eaten away by deposits of fish scales accumulated from the nets which they hung there to dry. In front of the house there was a well-tended vegetable garden, another necessity among Jews, indeed their chief source of food. Apart from the house there was a small hut leaning against 2 old olive trees. The walls were of baked clay, supported by logs, and covered by a network of palm leaves. A little ladder led to the flat roof, on which there was a booth, woven of palm branches, and topped by straw and twigs. The upper reaches of the olive trees shaded and protected the booth, which they had erected for the use of their rabbi. The sweet peas, which they had planted by the side of the house, were now in full blossom. They had worked their way up the walls, and their tendrils, laden with blue rosy, delicate flowers, made a wreath about the booth. When I entered that day, an elderly woman in a sackcloth covering was standing by the earthen oven, baking flat cakes over a twig fire. This was the woman concerning whom a remarkable story was current now in Capharnaum. Some days before she had fallen sick and had been on the point of death when the rabbi had healed her. All the town knew of the miracle that had occurred with Simon's mother-in-law, and crowds came to look at her. On one part of the hedge lay some nets, unused, the property of the fishermen who had left their trade to attach themselves completely to the rabbi. A few young people, members of the household, were busy in the yard helping in the preparation of the evening meal. I learned that they were going to hold that evening a sort of feast for a larger group of the rabbi's followers, hence the unusual stir of preparation. The women baked unleavened cakes, the men put boards together to make a long table. In one corner, a woman stood over a jar and washed the rabbi's clothes. The work went forward amid quiet. Instead of speaking, the men and women made signs to each other. They did not wish to disturb their rabbi, who had ascended to the booth and was now sunk in meditation and prayer. I saw that my entry into the yard had frightened the inhabitants, and I therefore withdrew. But that evening I returned in the company of my friend the centurion. We had exchanged our Roman garb for the simple sackcloth coverings worn by many of the Jews, so that we might attract as little attention as possible. When we arrived, we found numbers of people congregated about the gate, and we entered with them. We were admitted into the house of Simon and found ourselves in a fairly large room, from which everything had been removed except the mats of woven straw and the long, low table of rough boards on which I had seen them working in the afternoon. There were some 15 or 20 people present. Some of them sat on the floor, on the straw matting ranged about the table. Others stood. 2 earthen oil lamps hung down from the roof, but their dim light was scarcely needed, for it was a brilliant night of moon and stars, such as is common in the spring above the Sea of Gennesaret, and a silvery light came in through door and window. At the head of the table, half seated, half reclining, was the rabbi. His pale face and white garb shone out from the circle of black-bearded and black-haired men. The guests were mostly fishermen of the town and peasants from the surrounding country who had come that day to sell their wares, but having heard of the man of wonders, they had found their way to Simon's house to see and hear him, and perhaps be helped by him. The women of the house brought in earthen platters with the food prepared on the oven outside, flat cakes, small fishes baked in a covering of dough. This delicacy was in honor of the rabbi, and large quantities of green stuff from the garden. Other women had brought gifts to the rabbi, one a cruse of wine, another a jar of honey, a third fruit, dried grapes, and dates. Many children were present, young boys swathed in the tallit or prayer shawl. Thus fathers brought them before the rabbi, so that he might place his hands on their heads and bless them. He detained the children and made them sit near him. When the food had been placed on the table, and before any of the flat cakes had yet been broken, the rabbi called out, "Let us pray to our Father in heaven." One of the men answered, "Rabbi, we are ignorant men. We have not been taught to pray." Thereupon he said to them, "Is it not written, 'Ye shall be simple before your God'? You are more important in the eyes of God than the learned, for it is written, 'The simple and the upright shall comfort me.'" Another one said from a corner, "We are sinners, Rabbi."